The crystal amphitheater on Valdris Prime wasn't exactly where Marcus Reed had expected to spend his Tuesday morning. But then again, serving as humanity's liaison to the Etherian Coalition had taught him that diplomatic life rarely followed normal schedules. The amphitheater itself was a marvel of crystalline architecture that seemed to grow from the planet's surface like a natural formation, its faceted walls catching and refracting the binary sunset into patterns that shifted with the emotional resonance of its occupants. Today's ceremony was the ritual of renewed purpose, an ancient Etherian tradition that marked the formal transition from wartime protocols to peacetime governance. After 3 years of careful negotiations, both species were finally ready to move beyond the fragile armistice that had ended decades of conflict. The ritual would establish new relationships between human and Etherian representatives, creating the formal bonds necessary for long-term cooperation. Marcus adjusted his ceremonial robes, a compromise between human diplomatic attire and Etherian cultural requirements that made him feel like he was attending a very formal costume party. Around him, thousands of Etherians filled the amphitheater, their translucent skin shifting through subtle color patterns that reflected their collective emotional state. The effect was mesmerizing, like watching aurora patterns ripple through a living constellation. "Nervous?" asked Ambassador Chen, the senior human representative who'd been Marcus's mentor since his assignment to the neutral zone. Chen had the kind of diplomatic experience that came from 30 years of preventing interstellar incidents through careful word choice and strategic patience. "Terrified," Marcus admitted honestly. "I've spent 3 years learning Etherian customs, and I still feel like I'm one mistranslated word away from accidentally starting another war. That's what makes you good at this job. The overconfident ones are the dangerous ones." The ceremony began with harmonic resonances that seemed to vibrate through the crystal structure itself, creating music that was felt as much as heard. High Counselor Lyrillith stepped forward as the ceremony's focal point, and Marcus felt his breath catch as it did every time he saw her. Even by Etherian standards, she was extraordinarily beautiful, tall and graceful with silver-blue skin that shifted like aurora patterns across her features. Her eyes held depths that seemed to contain starlight, and her presence commanded attention without effort. As the Coalition's youngest council member and principal architect of the peace accords, Lyrillith represented everything hopeful about the new era of cooperation. She'd spent years building consensus among Etherian factions that had considered humans little better than barbarians, using a combination of political skill and spiritual authority that Marcus found both impressive and slightly intimidating. The naming rite was the ceremony's centerpiece, a formal recognition of the relationships that would define the new governmental structure. Each diplomatic representative would be asked to choose a title that would establish their connection to Etherian leadership. Marcus had prepared for this moment, reviewing cultural protocols and consulting with Etherian advisors about appropriate responses. Lyrillith moved through the gathered representatives with ceremonial grace, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustic properties. "Choose a title by which I shall know you in all our dealings," she asked each diplomat in turn, receiving responses like honored colleague, trusted advisor, and respectful partner. When she reached Marcus, her silver-blue eyes met his with an intensity that made the prepared words evaporate from his mind. The formal ceremony, the watching thousands, the weight of diplomatic protocol, it all suddenly felt overwhelming. In that moment of pressure, his natural defense mechanism kicked in: humor. "My husband," he said with a slight smile, intending it as a gentle joke about the formal intimacy of their diplomatic partnership. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Every Etherian in the amphitheater fell completely silent, their skin shifting to brilliant gold patterns that Marcus had never seen before. The ceremonial crystals around them began resonating with new harmonics that seemed to celebrate something momentous. Lyrillith's eyes widened with an expression that combined shock, wonder, and something deeper that Marcus couldn't identify. "Did I just—" Marcus began. But the words died as he realized that every single Etherian was staring at him, with expressions ranging from amazement to profound reverence. Lyrillith's skin had shifted to a pattern of silver and gold that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, creating a display so beautiful it was almost hypnotic. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the crystal structure itself. "The bond is acknowledged," she said formally, though Marcus could hear something that sounded like barely controlled emotion beneath the ceremonial words. "Let the records show that the soul bond has been declared and accepted." Marcus felt something shift in the air around them, not physically, but on some level that he couldn't quite define. It was as if the universe had rearranged itself in subtle ways, creating connections that hadn't existed moments before. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you were about to fall into something you didn't understand. "What exactly did I just do?" he whispered to Ambassador Chen, who was staring at him with the expression of someone watching a traffic accident in slow motion. "I think," Chen replied carefully, "you just accidentally married the most powerful woman in the Etherian coalition." The ceremony continued around them, but Marcus was only dimly aware of the proceedings. His attention was entirely focused on Lyrillith, who seemed to be experiencing her own moment of profound realization. Their eyes met across the formal distance required by the ritual, and he felt something pass between them, a recognition that neither of them fully understood, but both could feel changing the fundamental nature of their relationship. As the ritual concluded, and the gathered Etherians began filing out of the amphitheater, their skin patterns still showing the gold excitement of witnessing something unprecedented, Marcus realized that his simple attempt at diplomatic humor had just altered the course of interspecies relations in ways he couldn't begin to calculate. "So," he said to Lyrillith as the crowds dispersed, leaving them standing together in the crystalline space that still hummed with residual harmonics, "I'm guessing this is going to require some paperwork." Her laugh was like music, carrying harmonics that made the crystals around them chime in response. "Marcus Reed," she said, and he noticed that his name sounded different when she spoke it, more real somehow, as if it carried weight it hadn't possessed before. "I believe we need to have a very long conversation about Etherian marriage customs. Please tell me there's a grace period for cultural misunderstandings." "I'm afraid not, though I suspect that what just happened between us was not entirely a misunderstanding." As they walked together through the crystal corridors that led away from the amphitheater, Marcus reflected that diplomatic life had just become significantly more complicated. He'd spent 3 years carefully avoiding any action that might destabilize the peace process, and now he'd apparently married into the Etherian government through the power of poorly timed humor. But as he felt the strange new connection humming between them like a tuning fork struck in perfect harmony, he found himself thinking that maybe, just this once, his tendency to say the wrong thing at the wrong time might have worked out exactly right. Marcus discovered the true scope of his diplomatic accident when he tried to return to his quarters, and found that his access card now opened doors that had been sealed to him for 3 years. The Etherian governmental complex was vast and labyrinthine, its crystal corridors extending deep into the planet's crust, where the most sensitive operations were conducted. Areas that had previously been marked with polite but firm, authorized personnel only. Barriers now welcomed him with the same harmonic chimes that greeted high-ranking officials. "This can't be right," he muttered, standing before a door marked with symbols that roughly translated to Coalition War Archives Council members only. His access card touched the scanner, and the door dissolved into the wall with a musical tone that sounded distinctly pleased. The archives beyond contained 3 decades of military intelligence, diplomatic correspondence, and strategic analysis that no human had ever been authorized to view. Marcus found himself drawn to recent files marked with priority classifications, his enhanced access revealing patterns of information that painted a disturbing picture of the conflict's true nature. "You shouldn't be here," a familiar voice said behind him, though there was no alarm in Lyrillith's tone, only a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she'd expected to find him exactly where he was. "I know," Marcus replied, not turning away from the holographic displays that showed supply chain analyses and financial transfers between corporations and military suppliers. "But apparently I can be here now, which raises some interesting questions about what exactly happened in that ceremony." Lyrillith moved to stand beside him, her presence both comforting and electric in ways that Marcus was still trying to understand. In the soft light of the archives, her skin showed subtle patterns of blue and silver that seemed to respond to his emotional state. "The soul bond is our most sacred form of partnership," she explained, gesturing toward the data displays that continued to reveal evidence of systematic war profiteering. "It creates permanent connections between individuals whose spiritual essences resonate in perfect harmony. Bonded pairs share thoughts, emotions, and governmental authority." "Governmental authority," Marcus repeated, studying financial records that showed massive profits flowing to both human and Etherian corporations from weapons sales and military contracts. "Which explains why I can suddenly access classified information that should be way above my pay grade. The bond cannot be faked or forced," Lyrillith continued, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was still processing the implications herself. "It only forms between souls that are truly compatible. The fact that it activated when you spoke those words means." "Means what?" "Means that on some fundamental level, we were already connected. Your words simply gave that connection formal recognition." Marcus turned to look at her directly, seeing the same confusion and wonder in her expression that he felt himself. The bond between them hummed like a tuning fork, creating an awareness of her emotional state that was both intimate and startling. He could sense her uncertainty about their situation, her dedication to peace, and underneath it all, a growing warmth that suggested their accidental connection was becoming something more deliberate. "These records," he said, returning his attention to the evidence before them, "they show systematic manipulation of both our governments. Someone's been deliberately prolonging the conflict." The financial trails were complex but clear once the pattern emerged. Human corporations had been selling weapons to Etherian separatist factions, while simultaneously supplying the coalition military with intelligence about those same separatists. Etherian noble houses had been funding human military contractors while publicly supporting peace negotiations. The web of corruption extended to the highest levels of both governments, with individuals who had public reputations as peacekeepers secretly profiting from continued warfare. "This is why the armistice has been so fragile," Lyrillith realized, her skin shifting to patterns of deep purple that Marcus was learning indicated intense concentration. "Every time we approached lasting peace, someone would create an incident that forced us back to the negotiating table. But never back to open warfare," Marcus added, understanding the strategy. "Just enough conflict to keep the military contracts flowing, but not enough to actually resolve anything permanently." Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Chen, whose expression suggested that Marcus's diplomatic situation had become significantly more complicated in the few hours since the ceremony. "We need to talk," Chen said grimly. "Both of you. Earth Command has some very strong opinions about your new marital status." They relocated to Lyrillith's private study, a crystalline chamber that resonated with harmonic frequencies designed to promote clear thinking and emotional balance. The room's walls displayed slowly shifting patterns that responded to the occupants' mental states, creating an environment that was both beautiful and slightly unnerving for someone accustomed to static human architecture. Defense Secretary Harrison is en route from Earth, Chen reported, along with a team of specialists whose job descriptions include words like extraction and containment. They're treating this as a security breach of the highest order. Security breach? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand the implications. You now have access to Etherian military intelligence and governmental systems through your bond, Chen explained. From Earth's perspective, you're either a compromised asset or a potential double agent. They want you extracted and debriefed before you can share classified information with hostile forces. Hostile forces? Lyrillith's voice carried harmonics that made the crystal walls chime with what sounded distinctly like indignation. We are allies now. The armistice is exactly as fragile as it appears, Chen interrupted. There are factions on both sides who see this bond as either a threat to security or an opportunity to gain advantage. The hardliners in Earth's government view emotional connections to alien leaders as inherently compromising. Marcus felt Lyrillith's emotional response through their bond. Hurt, anger, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that their accidental connection was being viewed as a betrayal rather than a bridge between species. Her feelings resonated with his own growing frustration at the political complications surrounding what had started as an innocent joke. There's more, Chen continued reluctantly. Council Elder Vorthak is mobilizing traditionalist factions who view your presence in sacred governmental spaces as contamination of Etherian purity. They're demanding that Lyrillith undergo the ritual of severance to break the bond. What does that involve? Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Spiritual and psychological separation that would sever all connections between us, Lyrillith replied, her skin shifting to patterns that suggested profound distress. But the ritual also strips the participants of their governmental authority as punishment for forming impure bonds. I would lose my position on the council. The room fell silent, except for the soft harmonics that seemed to respond to their collective emotional state. Marcus stared at the evidence of war profiteering they'd uncovered, realizing that their accidental bond had given them the key to exposing a conspiracy that threatened both species, but only if they could survive the political pressure long enough to use it. How long do we have? He asked. Harrison arrives tomorrow, Chen said. Vorthak is calling for an emergency council session in 2 days. After that, the political pressure will become irresistible from both sides. Marcus felt Lyrillith's hand slip into his, her touch creating harmonic resonances that seemed to strengthen their bond. Through their connection, he sensed her determination to protect the peace they'd both worked to create, even at personal cost. There is one option, she said quietly. The Oath of Balance, a public ceremony that would formalize our bond and grant us emergency authority to address threats to interspecies peace. But Marcus... Taking the oath would make you a permanent resident of Etherian space. Earth would consider it defection. You could never return to your old life. As Marcus considered the choice before them, exposure and separation, or commitment and exile, he realized that the universe's tendency to complicate his existence. But as he felt the warmth of Lyrillith's presence through their bond, and looked at the evidence of corruption that only their combined authority could expose, he began to think that maybe some choices were worth making, regardless of the cost. Defense Secretary Harrison arrived on Valdris Prime with all the subtlety of a military invasion. His delegation, including intelligence operatives, whose presence turned the diplomatic quarter into an armed camp. Marcus watched from Lyrillith's study as human soldiers in full combat gear established security perimeters around the embassy complex, their weapons trained on the Crystal Gardens where Etherian civilians had gathered to witness the unprecedented soul bond. They're treating this like a hostage situation, Marcus observed, studying the tactical deployments that suggested Harrison's team had come prepared for extraction by force if necessary. From their perspective, perhaps they are, Lyrillith replied, her skin showing patterns of deep blue that Marcus had learned indicated profound sadness. They see you as compromised by alien influence, just as my people's traditionalists see me as contaminated by human contact. Through their bond, Marcus could feel the weight of political pressure bearing down on both of them. The connection had deepened overnight, allowing them to share not just thoughts and emotions, but also cultural perspectives that helped them understand each other's positions in ways that transcended species boundaries. He experienced Etherian concepts of spiritual harmony that emphasized consensus and balance, while she gained insight into human pragmatism and the sometimes necessary acceptance of imperfect solutions. Harrison's demands were delivered with military precision and barely concealed hostility. He wanted Marcus extracted within 24 hours for comprehensive debriefing and psychological evaluation to determine the extent of alien influence on his judgment. The euphemisms couldn't hide the reality. They intended to classify him as a compromised asset and subject him to procedures designed to break whatever connection existed between him and Lyrillith. You've been exposed to alien mental manipulation technologies, Harrison explained during their tense meeting in the embassy's secure conference room. Standard protocols require immediate isolation and treatment to prevent further contamination of classified information. It's not manipulation, Marcus protested. It's partnership. We're sharing information that could expose massive corruption in both our governments. Exactly the kind of rationalization we'd expect from someone under alien influence, Harrison replied coldly. You've been compromised, Reed. The only question is whether you'll cooperate with extraction voluntarily or require alternative measures. The alternative measures were left deliberately vague, but Marcus could see armed operatives positioned throughout the embassy complex. Harrison had clearly come prepared to take him by force if diplomatic pressure failed. Simultaneously, Council Elder Vorthak was mobilizing traditionalist factions who viewed the soul bond as a violation of Etherian purity. The Elder's speeches to the Coalition Assembly emphasized the danger of allowing human influence into their most sacred governmental spaces, arguing that Marcus's access to classified information represented a security breach that threatened Etherian sovereignty. The sacred ways have protected our people for millennia, Vorthak declared in a speech that was broadcast throughout Etherian space. We cannot allow them to be corrupted by alien concepts of partnership that reduce our spiritual bonds to mere political convenience. The traditionalist movement gained strength as more Etherians began to question whether the soul bond could truly be authentic between species with such different spiritual architectures. The debate divided the Coalition Assembly, with progressives supporting Lyrillith's position while conservatives rallied behind Vorthak's calls for immediate severance of the bond. Marcus and Lyrillith found themselves caught between escalating pressures from both sides, their investigation into the war profiteering conspiracy becoming secondary to their simple survival as political partners. The evidence they'd uncovered was damning. Financial records showing massive profits from prolonged conflict, communication intercepts revealing coordination between supposedly opposed factions, and strategic analyses proving that several major incidents had been deliberately staged to prevent lasting peace. They're planning to restart the war, Lyrillith realized as they reviewed the latest intelligence from their secure connection to the Coalition's military networks. The profiteers have been using the armistice period to position themselves for maximum profit when hostilities resume. The conspiracy was more extensive than either had initially realized. Human corporations had been secretly funding Etherian separatist movements while simultaneously selling weapons to coalition forces. Etherian noble houses had been financing human military contractors while publicly supporting peace negotiations. The web of corruption included high-ranking officials in both governments who had been deliberately sabotaging peace initiatives for personal gain. "Look at this timeline," Marcus said, highlighting a series of incidents that had derailed previous peace negotiations. "Every time our species approached lasting agreement, someone created a crisis that forced us back to the bargaining table. The Rigel Station bombing, the merchant convoy attacks, the diplomatic assassination attempt. They were all false flag operations designed to maintain profitable instability. The next phase is scheduled to begin in 3 weeks," Lyrillith discovered, accessing military deployment orders that showed massive troop movements disguised as routine exercises. "Both sides are being positioned for conflicts that will make the armistice impossible to maintain. Their shared authority through the soul bond was the only thing that allowed them to access this information. Neither government would have granted such comprehensive intelligence access to individuals from the opposing species. But that same shared authority was exactly what made them targets for those who wanted the conspiracy to remain hidden. The oath of balance," Lyrillith said quietly as they faced the impossible choice before them. "It's the only way to gain the emergency authority needed to expose this conspiracy and prevent the planned conflicts." Marcus understood the implications. The Oath of Balance was the most sacred commitment in Etherian culture, requiring both partners to pledge their lives, authority, and spiritual essence to the protection of peace and the welfare of all sentient beings within their influence. Taking the oath would grant them unprecedented emergency powers to declassify and broadcast evidence of the conspiracy. But it would also make Marcus a permanent resident of Etherian space, with no possibility of returning to his human citizenship. "Harrison will classify it as defection," Marcus said, knowing that his family, friends, and former colleagues would view his choice as betrayal of his own species. "Vorthak will use it as proof that I've been corrupted by human influence," Lyrillith added, aware that her political career and possibly her freedom would be forfeit if the traditionalists gained power. Through their bond, they shared the weight of the decision, not just the personal costs, but the potential consequences for billions of beings across both civilizations. The conspiracy they'd uncovered threatened to restart a war that had already claimed millions of lives, and the evidence needed to stop it was locked behind security protocols that only their combined authority could breach. "There's something else," Lyrillith said, her skin shifting to patterns that indicated deep emotional complexity. "The Oath of Balance isn't just a political ceremony. It's a permanent spiritual merger that would make our bond unbreakable by any known means. We would literally become part of each other's souls in ways that transcend individual identity." Marcus felt the truth of her words through their existing connection. The growing awareness that their accidental bond had evolved beyond political convenience into something that felt increasingly necessary for both their emotional and spiritual well-being. The thought of separation now seemed not just politically impossible but personally devastating. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked. "Harrison's extraction team moves at dawn," she replied. "Vorthak's emergency assembly convenes at the same time. After that, the choice will be made for us." As they stood together in the crystal chamber that had become their refuge from political pressure, Marcus realized that their joke about being married had become something far more real and consequential than either had imagined. The universe's sense of humor had placed them at the center of a conspiracy that threatened galactic peace, and their only weapon was a bond that neither government wanted them to possess. The decision they faced would determine not just their personal futures, but the fate of every being whose life depended on the fragile peace they'd both worked to create. Dawn on Valdris Prime arrived with crystalline clarity, the binary suns casting rainbow patterns through the crystal amphitheater, where Marcus and Lyrillith had chosen to hold their public oath of balance ceremony. The decision to proceed had been made in the dark hours before sunrise, when they realized that exposing the war-profiteering conspiracy was worth any personal cost. including the permanent exile from his species that Marcus would face for defecting to alien authority. Defense Secretary Harrison's extraction team had surrounded the amphitheater with military precision, their weapons trained on the ceremonial platform, where representatives from both species gathered to witness something unprecedented in interstellar history. Harrison himself stood at the edge of the crystal formation, his expression promising severe consequences for what he viewed as the ultimate betrayal of human interests. "This is your last chance, Reed," Harrison called out as the ceremony began, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustic properties. "Step away from the alien influence and return to your duties as a human citizen. Continue this charade, and you'll be classified as a defector and enemy of the state." Marcus felt the weight of the moment, not just Harrison's threats, but the presence of billions watching via interstellar communication networks as he chose between species loyalty and moral principle. Through his bond with Lyrillith, he could sense her own fears about Council Elder Vorthak's traditionalist faction, who had promised to strip her of all authority if she proceeded with what they viewed as spiritual contamination. "The Oath of Balance," Lyrillith began, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal walls resonate with ancient frequencies, "requires both partners to pledge their lives, authority, and spiritual essence to the protection of peace and the welfare of all sentient beings within their influence." As they spoke the ceremonial words that would bind them permanently, Marcus felt their soul bond evolve into something far deeper than shared access and emotional connection. The oath created a true merger of purpose that made them more effective together than either could be alone. His human pragmatism and adaptability, combining with her Etherian wisdom and spiritual insight, to create a partnership that transcended species boundaries. "I pledge my life to the cause of peace," Marcus declared, feeling the words carry weight beyond mere ceremony, "and my authority to the protection of all who suffer from the greed of those who profit from war." "I pledge my essence to the harmony of all beings," Lyrillith responded, her skin showing patterns of gold and silver that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the crystal formations around them, "and my power to the exposure of corruption wherever it hides." The moment their oath was complete, emergency authority protocols activated throughout both governmental systems. Their combined access suddenly expanded to include every classified file, military database, and intelligence archive in human and Etherian space. Marcus immediately began broadcasting the evidence they'd gathered, financial records, communication intercepts, and strategic analyses that revealed 3 decades of deliberate war profiteering. The revelations were devastating. Major human corporations had been funding Etherian separatist movements while selling weapons to coalition forces. Etherian noble houses had been financing human military contractors while publicly supporting peace negotiations. High-ranking officials in both governments had been systematically sabotaging peace initiatives to maintain profitable instability. "The Rigel Station bombing that killed 300 civilians," Marcus announced as the evidence streamed across every major news network in known space, "was orchestrated by Consolidated Defense Industries to prevent a breakthrough in peace negotiations. The merchant convoy attacks that nearly restarted the war were false flag operations, funded by the Vorthak family's private military investments." The amphitheater erupted in chaos as the implications became clear. Council Elder Vorthak himself was implicated in the conspiracy, his traditionalist rhetoric serving as cover for massive war profiteering. On the human side, Defense Secretary Harrison's own communications showed his involvement in suppressing evidence of corporate corruption. "You've doomed both our species," Harrison snarled, but his words lacked conviction as his own crimes were broadcast to billions of viewers. "The strategic balance that kept us from mutual annihilation was built on lies and the bodies of innocents," Lyrillith interrupted, her voice carrying new authority from their completed bond. "The balance you protected was the balance of profitable death. As security forces from both governments moved to arrest the exposed conspirators, Marcus and Lyrillith used their emergency authority to open every sealed refugee corridor, deploy medical aid to disaster zones that had been deliberately neglected, and begin the massive humanitarian effort needed to address decades of war profiteering's consequences. The trials that followed reshaped both governments as the extent of the conspiracy became clear. Harrison and his intelligence network faced charges for war crimes and treason. Vorthak and his traditionalist allies were stripped of authority for using religious rhetoric to cover political corruption. Moderate voices in both species gained power as extremist factions lost credibility. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the observation deck of the newly established Interspecies Cooperation Station, watching construction crews from both species work together on the first joint colony ship that would carry mixed populations to new worlds beyond the scars of their ancient conflict. His bond with Lyrillith had evolved beyond political necessity into genuine love and partnership, their unique connection allowing them to bridge cultural differences that had seemed insurmountable. "Any regrets about your change in citizenship status?" Lyrillith asked, joining him at the observation window. Their bond allowed them to share thoughts and emotions so completely that conversation often felt like internal dialogue between complementary aspects of the same consciousness. "None," Marcus replied honestly, watching human engineers collaborate with Etherian bioarchitects on designs that neither species could have conceived alone. "Though I have to admit, when I made that joke about being your husband, I never expected it would lead to co-administering an interstellar refugee resettlement program." "The universe has an interesting sense of humor," she agreed, her skin showing patterns that reflected both amusement and deep contentment. "Though I suspect our bond was never really an accident. Perhaps the ceremony simply gave formal recognition to a connection that already existed." The refugee colonies they'd helped establish had become thriving communities, where humans and Etherians shared knowledge, culture, and resources in ways that benefited both species. Marcus's characteristic humor had become legendary among Etherian populations, who discovered that laughter was indeed a universal language that transcended biological differences. "The Andromedan system applications are ready for review," Lyrillith mentioned, accessing the shared databases through their bond. 15,000 families wanting to establish the first trispecies colony with the Centauri refugees. "Trispecies?" Marcus asked, then smiled as he understood. "The children, the first generation born to mixed human-Etherian partnerships." Their bond allowed them to evaluate the colony applications with both human practicality and Etherian wisdom, ensuring that the communities they helped establish would have the resources and cultural understanding needed to thrive. The peace they'd accidentally created through a misunderstood joke was evolving into something far greater, a fundamental transformation in how different species could coexist. As they reviewed the applications together, their shared consciousness processing information with efficiency that astounded both governmental systems, Marcus reflected that his tendency to say the wrong thing at the wrong time had finally worked in his favor. His casual joke had cost him his human citizenship and his previous life, but it had given him something infinitely more valuable: a partnership that bridged worlds and a purpose that transcended the boundaries of individual identity. Ready for another day of accidentally reshaping interstellar civilization? Lyrillith asked, her mental voice carrying the warmth and humor that had become the foundation of everything they'd built together. "Always," Marcus replied, feeling their bond resonate with shared purpose and unshakable love. "Though next time someone asks me to choose a title, I'm sticking with something simple like colleague or friend." Her laughter rippled through their connection like music, harmonizing with his own amusement as they turned their attention to the endless work of building a peace that would outlast both their species' capacity for fear and misunderstanding.